AP Euro proudly presents French Absolutism. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, whatever time of day it is. I want to welcome you to another proud SIGcast. AP Euro proudly presents this episode of French Absolutism. In the background to it, I'm going to take you through some important information that will help you understand the next phase of Chapter 15 in Jackson J. Spielvogel's Western Civilization. So we start with a big picture. In the wake of the disastrous wars of religion that we mentioned in really Chapter 14 and parts of Chapter 13, and even the beginning parts of Chapter 15 with the 30 Years' War, basically in the late 16th century, King Henry IV was the first of the French Bourbon kings. And what he did was he began to restore the power of the French monarchy, which was in disarray as the Valois family broke down in their power. Remember the War of the Three Henrys. Then in the early 17th century, or the 1600s, Cardinal Richelieu of France, the chief minister to Louis XIII, raised the authority of the French monarchy to new heights and increased France's power in Europe. Now, after Cardinal Richelieu, Cardinal Mazarin will continue Richelieu's work during the early years of the reign of King Louis XIV, further reducing the power of the nobility. And after the Louis XIV's personal rule, which began in 1661, the French absolute monarchy stood at the height of its power, both in France and also throughout Europe. The wars of Louis XIV would prove extremely costly, however, and left France a burden of debt that would eventually lead to the French monarchy to collapse in, there's a typo right there, I apologize, the 18th century, which is the 1700s. Nevertheless, in the 17th century, France was the most powerful country in Europe. The beginning of this PowerPoint and this presentation is the story of that rise of the theory that will allow France to become the most powerful country in Europe. And this is the age of the absolute monarchs. Now, some background and the theory of absolutism as it exists. Sovereignty is a word, it's a term that a lot of times textbooks, and your textbook in particular, throws around. And if you look this up, sovereignty is defined, and what it means is who has supreme power or supreme authority. Now, in many nations that we've learned about so far during this particular year, starting in Chapter 11 over your summer assignment, during the Middle Ages, that question really wasn't easy to answer. Who had power? Who had ultimate authority? Under feudalism and the invasions of the Dark Ages, central power broke down, and many nobles within the borders of the nation-states that we are currently learning about held much power in their local domain. So in many cases, the power was spread out. The power was actually in the hands, in some cases, of the nobility. Now, during Chapter 12, we learned about this new concept of new monarchs. And those new monarchs that we learned about, like Louis XI, the Spider King, like Ferdinand and Isabella in Spain, like Henry VII in England, what they were trying to do was, and what they were actually accomplishing was, they were beginning to take power back away from the nobility and bring stability to within their domains. Now, after the period of the Renaissance, if you think about it, from Chapter 13 through the beginning of Chapter 15, we learned about the wars of religion in France. We learned about the War of the Three Henrys. We learned about Habsburg-Valois tension in the dynastic struggle that was. We learned about religious wars due to the tension between Protestants and Catholics following the Reformation and, once again, the Counter-Reformation. The bottom line is Europe kept tearing itself apart over whether it was dynastic tension or religion. So many people were really looking for a solution, for an answer. What can we do to bring peace and stability back to Europe, back to France, back to England, back to wherever? And a lot of people thought about sovereignty in a new way. Many decided that sovereign power and the ultimate authority of a state should rest in the hands of a monarch. Where did they get that power? Where else, silly? God. Divine right. That was what people were selling. It went back to God. Now, the notion here that we're going to start talking about here as absolutism, it's important to note that these absolutes were not going to be subordinate to any national assemblies. So people that associated themselves with absolutism weren't going to play games with Parliament in Britain. They didn't want to play games with the Estates General in France. So, the goal here and what you need to understand is there was going to be a weakening of the nobility in the West. However, as I always tell you, what you need to understand is the nobility in the East will remain strong, and absolutism in the East is not quite as successful as their Western counterparts. Now, when we get into the theory of absolutism, we need to also talk about some of its characteristics. So we talked a little bit about sovereignty and what that was all about. We talked about they're not going to be subordinate to national assemblies. Let's talk about here about bureaucracies. We're talking about bureaucracies in the 17th century. These are career officials. Sometimes these officials serve lifetime terms, okay? And what we're starting to see here, early on, a lot of these members of the bureaucracies were nobility. Well, what we're starting to see is a continuation of what started with some of the new monarchs. They start to appoint many bourgeoisie or middle class bureaucrats or new nobility. And again, to be a new noble, in many cases, you could purchase a title of nobility from the king. And, a lot of people with the commercial revolution, we start to see the growth of the middle class. A lot of people were tired of listening to the old nobility. These new people with these new riches, they were called, were eager to play a role while weakening the power of the nobility. They wanted to be in the game, so to speak. So the kings and the monarchs, they'll use this as a way to enforce loyalty. You want to take power away from the old nobility, put these new cats in positions, and they're going to be loyal, they're going to be professional. You're going to also get, as the last bullet here says, you're going to want a new type of professional full-time army, as we saw in the 30 Years' War. Mercenaries don't always work out. Why? Because if you can't pay them right away, they'll switch allegiance immediately, or they'll rape and pillage and plunder, if they think they're not going to get paid. So you want to have a loyal, professional, full-time army, and that was part of the military revolution that you read about in the early part of chapter 15. Now, coincidentally, I want to kind of throw a few new terms at you. The new nobility, as they were called, were members of the bourgeoisie or rising members of the bourgeoisie. In many of these countries, and in particular France, they were called the nobles of the robe. So please write that down. They were people that purchased their titles from the monarchy. Okay? Now, in church and state. All right, we got to talk about church and state here. The French and Spanish monarchies gained effective control of the Roman Catholic Church in their country. We talked about that with the Inquisition in Spain, but in France we also talked about that after the Concordat of Bologna, and the Gallican Church was created. So those are the two best examples of church and state. But, again, a lot of people said, what, if we're going to have stability here, we've got to have one church, one official state church, and that's the only way we're going to prevent further religious civil wars, which are usually the worst. Okay, so we talked about military a little bit already, but I'm just going to repeat myself here. The goal was to maintain large standing armies during peacetime. Monarchs no longer wanted to rely on mercenary soldiers or nobles in their armies as they did during feudalism, which had been the case earlier. So what they started to do is they started to have conscripts, all right, people that were drafted or forced, and sometimes they were peasants, but you wanted a large standing army to basically go ahead and be at your beck and call. There was, in some cases, secret police. They wanted to create some fear. You're probably thinking right now, wait, that sounds like Hitler, that sounds like totalitarianism in the 20th century. It's similar, okay? But what we really need to keep in perspective here is they lacked the technology and the military resources of, say, a Stalin and a Hitler. Remember, there was no radio, and we still have an era where there's not a lot of literacy, if you will. So they didn't really try to control the masses like in the 20th century through things like the Doplavaro or Strength Through Joy, the Hitler Youth brown shirts that we'll talk about a little bit later, prior to World War II, where they used propaganda. But really what their goal was, they used their secret police forces to really focus on destroying the strength of the nobility. Okay? So we get into the philosophy of absolutism. Who were advocates? Who were these people that thought, hey, this is a great idea? And really, one of the first to provide the theoretical basis for absolute states was Jean Bodin. Okay, and he lived and he wrote during the chaos of the French civil wars of the late 16th century. And he believed that only absolutism could provide order and force people to obey government. Okay, so that's Jean Bodin, and he kind of gets the ball rolling with this theory, if you will, puts it on the map. Okay, another advocate, number two, we would say would have been Bishop Jacques Bossuet. All right, and he's probably the most important of the divine right crowd. He's the principal advocate of the divine right of kings in France during the age, what will be the age of Louis XIV. He's actually the court preacher of Louis XIV, so that's a little bit of a point of view, outside information for you that you probably want to make sure that you know. And he wrote his theory down. It was called Politics Drawn from the Very Words of the Holy Scripture. And basically he says that the government is divinely ordained by God so that humans could live in an organized and peaceful society. Okay, again, we talked a little bit about this with Luther's response as well to the Peasants' Revolt in 1524 to 1525. But again, it stated that God established kings through divine right, and through these divine right kings, God was able to reign over all the peoples in the world. Okay, so kings were responsible in divine right to no one, no assemblies, no other constituents, no one other than God. And obviously that's going to be problematic in the beginning. Okay, I guess the third advocate we want to mention and kind of get out in the open here is a guy named Thomas Hobbes. Again, we're talking about France in the first two advocates. This guy's a little bit different. We're talking about somebody that is actually thinking this is a good idea in other areas of Europe as well. And so in terms of an advocate, Hobbes didn't advocate divine right. So let's make sure that we know that. Okay, and again, this is the old textbook, so this isn't going to be real. This is a little bit later in your text, but his ideas are actually going to be more in touch with Voltaire and enlightened despots of the 17th and 18th century. Okay, but we got to talk about his state of nature, and that's a really, really sexy term on the AP exam. We're going to be talking about Hobbes' state of nature. We're going to talk about John Locke's vision or state of nature, or characteristics, natural characteristics of human beings. We'll even talk about a state of nature in the Enlightenment with a guy named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So he says that human beings are just dirt, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, just animalistic, and that if given the right, they'll prefer anarchy and chaos because of their greed and all of this nasty stuff that they're all about. So he writes a book, and it's called The Great Leviathan, and he basically says that society for peace, stability, must submit to a great Leviathan. Okay, so giving you a little bit of a background here in the theory of absolutism, okay, and why people were thinking about this. You can't think about it in the context as we in the 21st century, how especially in the United States, where we are all about representative republic, a constitution, and the Bill of Rights. All right, you've got to look at it in the terms of the context of the era that we're studying, and we're talking about, think of the end of basically chapter 13 through 15, war after war after war, civil war after civil war, basically over religious issues. So these guys are trying to solve a problem, and they're saying we need stability, we need peace. Okay, that's their ultimate goal. So I hope that is a little bit of a good introduction for you. Hopefully that allows you to read the text a little bit more efficiently in some of the ideas that we'll cover in class. Thanks for tuning in.